introducing myself, and then I will hand it off to you guys. I guess we're ready to go. Alrighty, my name is Veronica G. Henry. I'm an author of science fiction and fantasy and mystery and some other stuff in between. Let's see, my work, my two novels. First is Bacchanal. Bacchanal is an historical fantasy about a young woman who must uncover some pretty interesting latent magical abilities in order to defeat an ancient evil that is powering a Depression era carnival. So that's Bacchanal. My second novel is called The Quarter Storm, and it's sort of a mystery fantasy genre building mashup. And that is about a voodoo priestess set in New Orleans who must use her wits and her connection to the spirits in order to solve a ritualistic murder that implicates her tradition. So that's me. I will hand it off next to Ewan.
Yeah, so I'm Ellen. I write speculative fiction and I'm based in London right now, but I grew up in Hong Kong. And so I have a couple of poems and short fiction out in places like Uncanny and the Deadlands, and a couple more coming up over the next few months. And also I'm on sub with a manuscript right now. So yeah, that's me. And I also work in theater and film, so basically theater making and devising. So yeah, right.
Great.
Excellent. Okay, Victor.
Hi, so I'm Victor Manibo. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a Filipino SFF writer. I'm based in New York City. I am debuting this summer in August 2nd, 2022. My sci-fi noir mystery is coming out. It's called The Sleepless, and it's from Erewhon Books. It's about a near future world where part of the population does not require sleep and doesn't suffer any physical or psychological drawbacks. And the plot starts off with a mystery. Somebody is dead, and our protagonist has to solve that. Obviously, it's connected to this whole sleepless world, and it's also a little bit of a critique of capitalism and our culture of like productivity. People just don't want to sleep and just want to work all the time.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff that I like to write. Mysteries, thrillers that have like that kind of like peek into society and how we live now.
Excellent. And a speculative element as well.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just excited to dive in today. So I kind of wanted to start out with just laying the groundwork for some definitions. I believe that mystery in some form or fashion is kind of at the heart of every story, even if it's not a traditional mystery, right? But if we are all in agreement with that, then, and then suspense, of course, is an element of that. Suspense is an element also of every story. But let's talk a little bit about the difference between mystery and suspense. Whoever wants to go first.
How about you?
Sure. I can jump in first. So I completely agree with you. I think every story is a mystery in that as a reader, when you approach it, you have to uncover some questions about this world, about the characters, and that's what a mystery is. It's about um, answering certain questions. As a genre, there's this famous like Hitchcock quote where mystery is an intellectual pursuit, and suspense or thriller is an emotional process. So mystery is like you're trying as a reader to answer certain questions, and as a genre, the question is very integral, like woven into the DNA of the plot. At least that's how I think I would personally define it. And then suspense or thriller, it kind of is about the emotional response that the reader gets based on what the writer sets up. And because they're kind of similar but on two tracks, a lot of stories will have an overlap. You'll have a story that's a mystery thriller or mystery suspense. And I think, especially for longer works like novels, it's almost unavoidable. You will have a mystery, but also suspenseful moments where your protagonist or the characters that you are invested in are in some sort of peril, right?
Absolutely. Ellen, would you like to take a shot at that one too?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. And so because for me, mystery and suspense are so tightly interwoven, and um, I kind of think suspense is about the how of it, while mystery asks why it happened and what is happening. And there's such a difference between the two of them. So like suspense is there's a lot about um aesthetics and also like raw visceral feelings when it comes to suspense, while the mystery is more about like um concrete things that happened, or like trying to find concrete answers to things. And um both of these can be found in different genres. For example, like I don't know, if you take romance for example, it's about like will they or won't they? But for romance, you already know they're going to end up together. So it's not exactly a mystery, but there is also a huge suspense in how they're going to get together. And for something like a straight up thriller, for example, it's there are lots of like central questions to be answered about like who killed whom, or like what happened to this other person. And so, in order to build that mystery, you kind of need suspense to propel it. And so, that's kind of how I also try to think about these two. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent points, both of you. I want to go off on something that Ellen just mentioned, and that is pacing. Let's talk a little bit about how pacing differs from like your typical maybe fantasy, then to a mystery, and then to a thriller. What do you guys think about pacing?
Um, for me, one of the things that I learned early on in writing a mystery is pacing is very important. It's critical because with both mystery and suspense, um, you want to keep the reader keep going, and with mystery, you do that by prolonging the question. Like you want the question to be answered right at the very end and not like in the middle, and then you have this really long runway and you don't know how to finish your story. And with
Mhm.
suspense, what keeps you reading is this question of like, oh no, what's going to happen to our main character? Oh no, what's going to happen to this person that I've been following? And so the way to do it for a mystery, at least in terms of pacing, is you have to dole out your questions in at certain parts where the ultimate question, for example, if you have a whodunit, a murder mystery, the ultimate question should be at the end, but you have to have intermediate questions that get answered and raised and then lead to more questions that like expand into eventually the ultimate question. Now, in terms of mechanics of pacing, you can deploy chapter breaks effectively for that. Or, although I think chapter breaks are more, um, I think, more effective when we're trying to write a thriller where you're doing a cliffhanger at a chapter break or an act break. But mysteries, you can employ the same techniques in the same way.
Ellen, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. So for different genres, I think when you're talking about fantasy as opposed to mystery, as opposed to, I guess, a thriller, a thriller has to be really taught because it's all about the visual sense of being in there, and it's not about solving the mystery, it's the process of it. And you have to cut out so much of the scaffold, like to get to the meat of it, and you have to cut out a lot just to have a scaffolding that the reader can cling on to and to kind of like experience along with the protagonist of story as well. And for fantasy, because so much of it is about like the aesthetic and also the world building of it. And it's, for example, if you're doing a fantasy or a space opera or sci-fi, whatever, um, that also has elements of mystery or suspense, you have to juggle both the central mystery and the central questions that it's trying to ask with the world around it, especially if you're doing a second world one. And you have to put a lot of, I guess, how do I say it? It's like, hmm. So one book I recently read is America Called Empire by R.K.D. Martin, that kind of weaves suspense and mystery into a space opera really, really effectively. And it does that by asking the central question of who killed one of the main characters while showing us the world and how that affects the way the mystery is solved. So that kind of is a long-winded way of talking about like the difference between those, I guess. Yeah.
But actually, really, really good points, and especially the novel that you just brought up, it kind of makes me think about setting and atmosphere and those types of things and how they play in. So let's talk a little bit about setting and atmosphere and how you can employ those to help build your mystery. Victor, go for it.
Sure. So I think setting an atmosphere lends itself better to suspense and thriller than mystery because, as I as we all have mentioned, I think suspense and thriller, it's more of an emotional process. So, you have a creepy, unsettling setting. You get a sense of dread, you get a sense of anticipation as to what's going to happen. Uh, which is not to say that setting an atmosphere can't lend itself to mysteries. Like, there are a lot of mysteries that are very tightly bound to the setting, where the setting itself is the mystery. A couple of recent examples that I can think of is uh, Piranesi by Susanna Clark. It's not exactly a mystery, although there are questions that are raised as you read the book about who is this character that we're following, what is this world that he is living in, and what is going on here. Which again goes back to what we were saying earlier, where like every story is a mystery.
Yeah.
Piranesi is not a traditional mystery where you have like a central question of like who murdered who or something like that, but there are big questions that have to be answered that's very tied into the setting. Um, another a recent example of setting as the mystery itself is The Cartographers by Pong Shepard, which just came out this month. It involves a lot of maps, and I don't want to spoil it, but it involves a certain place that has certain supernatural magical properties, and our cast of characters have to figure out what's going on in this place. There are a lot of questions raised for that the setting and the obviously atmosphere is weaved into the setting because that's how you bring the setting to life. But yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you on that. And also kind of um definitely ditching on cartographers and how it weaves this suspense into a type, like, I guess you can say mystery plot. And so because atmosphere in mystery, like if you're talking about really, really old fashioned mysteries, like I guess the Hercule Poirot mysteries, Sherlock Holmes, it's also tightly woven in, I mean, atmosphere is also tightly woven into those as well. Like you can see in like the Orient Express, for example, it's so much about the setting itself as well. And it's also kind of like, because I think of atmosphere as such a huge part of suspense, and suspense also a huge propelling force behind mystery.
Mhm.
I think all three are so tightly interwoven. Like you can't do a mystery without layering hints of suspense that can propel the reader towards the answer. So building on to atmosphere and how kind of like I'm trying to think of an example like Parnasi, the one you brought up. Um like the house and also kind of like the way it's structured, you're kept in this sort of like claustrophobic atmosphere, and you have no choice but to follow along with the narrator as he explores the house and also um figure out just what the hell is going on. So it's kind of yeah, I'm kind of rambling here, but
Mhm. No, that's okay. No,
yeah.
good points again. One of the things, like in my novel, The Quarter Storm, the setting obviously is New Orleans, and that's a city, if you haven't visited yet, you absolutely have to.
Love
But it
New
became
Orleans.
really important to make the city and that atmosphere and the setting such a unique place in America, to make that an important part of the story, and to do so with as much accuracy as I possibly could. Can you guys talk about maybe pieces of your own work in which you had to weave in setting or atmosphere into your story, and how you went about doing that, just your process?
Sure. My debut, The Sleepless, is near future New York, where I live. So that kind of is cheating almost. It's a little bit easier because it's a city that I'm familiar with, and because it's near future, I can kind of project, a few decades forward and see what this city is going to be like in a few years. Now, because it's a mystery that involves a world where people um, don't sleep or don't require sleep, or at least a fraction of the population doesn't require sleep. So I had to think of New York as what would New York be like um, if a fraction of the population doesn't sleep. And, again, maybe this isn't much of a stretch anymore because New York is almost a 24-hour city, depending on the neighborhood, obviously. But in my work, what I had to do was, okay, there would be enclaves of of sleepless populations where they want to be in certain neighborhoods where everything is just on 24/7. And we're not just talking about bars and restaurants, we're also talking about businesses, about offices, about schools, about recreational facilities. So and putting that world together and kind of juxtaposing that against the normal world, the people who still sleep, kind of builds the mystery of, okay, well, what are the rules here and how does that impact the eventual plot, which is the bigger plot, which is like how how will this world function if everybody became sleepless? So that's how I set up my setting to weave into the plot of it, which is you take a microcosm of a city and use that as an example to further the larger point that I was trying to make, which is resolved by the end of the book.
What about you, Evan?
So my novel that's currently about to go on submission now is a not exactly near future, but half dystopian novel about like a nuclear plant leak and electronic waste spills in a fictional city that is drawn from a fictionalized Hong Kong, where I come from. And so it was relatively easy to weave in the atmosphere into the story itself. And because the story has a central mystery in it that isn't kind of the main point of the story, but is part of a subplot, I guess you can say that. Yeah. And so I kind of drew from a lot of the noir films from Hong Kong that I watched as a kid. Stuff like in Infernal Affairs, and also like recent stuff as well. And I find that drawing from different mediums as well as genres as well can really help in kind of bringing a work to life, because like for example there are lots of really great noir mysteries films. For example, The Third Man, I forgot who's by, yeah, the classic one. And kind of like stuff like that, the way they do mystery and also build suspense through music, and also their, like, I guess cinematography as well, is has helped a lot for in like in my own writing as well, because it kind of forces me to think of ways to bring, I guess, like for example, how do you translate music, a suspense for music, into your prose and stuff like that. So I guess that's kind of how I do it as well.
Mhm.
So yeah.
You bring up a really good point about film and other mediums and how those influence. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that and talk about how some of those tropes and conventions that you might see in film translate over to our fiction as well.
Sure. I, I like to think of myself as a sci-fi noir writer, which is really interesting because noir is originally a film term, and like what Evan was just mentioning, in film you have all these other tools, like the visual tools, and also the sound, the score, and they don't really, you know. I am trying to capture that experience into words, but it's just a different animal altogether. Um, so you, at least for me, what I kind of do is just like I hew very closely to the trips, the plot trips and the visual trips, because those you can represent on the page.
Mhm.
Um, and at least for my work, you will have the brooding detective who has like a lot of baggage, or a wound in his history that he's still trying to resolve. You have the damsel in distress, or you have the femme fatale. You have these stock characters that are very familiar and very enjoyable to a lot of readers of mystery and noir. Um, but and are, at least I think, a lot of people's familiarity with those tropes or with those characters comes from film. And I try to be referential to that in terms of how they're introduced, at least, but then I infuse it with something new, because number one, I am Filipino. I am writing science fiction, and the noir films of the past, they don't really have this element. They don't really have agents, or they don't really have speculative elements. So, for example, in one of my projects, I have a femme fatale who hires this detective, a classic of film noir, right? You have this very voluptuous woman with long flowing hair and probably like too dressed up, and then you have the detective on his desk, maybe with like a bottle of whiskey and smoking a cigar. Uh, So I flip that, and I'm like, okay, the femme fatale still enters. She still has long flowing hair and a gown, but this is set in a space station, and and this is these are characters who are non-white, and the 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 similarity ends there. Like, she's a
Mhm.
mysterious woman. The reader gets, oh, a visual key. Oh yeah, this is a femme fatale character. Oh, but in the next paragraph, or like even in the in the next line, the first thing that she says is like, oh, this is not a femme fatale thing to say. So like, this is interesting. Like, I get what the reader gets what I'm trying to do, but hopefully is interested in the remix that I'm trying to do. So I guess that's how I approach those tropes. I use them liberally, but they're referential, and I put my own spin on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. In that, I try best to put my own spin on the tropes and also the conventions of perhaps noir films and also different kind of mystery films to bring my story to life. Because like for a medium like science fiction, like, and especially for like, I guess a novel, it's kind of, I don't say it, but it's like, well, I'm a very tactile kind of like writer in that I love paying attention to the sounds and the cadence and rhythms of the words. And I'm also like, I have a poetry background, so I guess that also comes naturally to me.
Mhm.
And so what I've noticed about like noir films and also neo noir as well is that they're so taut, and it's so much about like for suspense especially, it's so much about the score and the way it makes you feel like viscerally. And I try to evoke that in my prose as well. So it's that's one way I try to put um suspense into my own writing. But then I also love putting in tropes and conventions of mystery and suspense from films into my own work as well,
Mhm.
and try to, but I think of it more as, I guess, how do I say this? Like remixing the tropes or reworking the tropes and digging deeper to see why it's such a thing in noir films, guess,
Yeah.
and why these tropes are so effective and popular in noir films, and also kind of like because the settings are writing are mostly inspired by Hong Kong and other East and Southeast Asian um settings as well. So if I would think about like if I borrow those tropes and carry them over to a different setting, what are the impacts of that? And um what are the impacts of those tropes and conventions? Like for example, the femme fatale,
Mhm.
when they're placed in a kind of like completely different environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Good point. When you talk about the tropes too, some of the things that that we've discussed, the femme fatale, the typical detective, the noir setting, things like that. I see lots of those tropes, as you talked about, being challenged by placing people in new settings, by just kind of twisting all of that and turning it on its ear. But what are you both seeing in terms of some of the trends now, some of the ways that people are challenging those tropes? If you can think of specific examples in works, fiction or film, let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One of the things I was at another convention a while back, and we were talking about noir, sci-fi, and fantasy. And one of the stock tropes for mysteries and noir is the corrupt cop, or at least police officers who are either incompetent or corrupt.
Mhm.
And that is a trope that kind of is necessary because for these stories, the protagonist is usually not the cop. Obviously, if it's a cop story, then that's a different thing, right? Um, so um, one of the interesting things that came out of that conversation that I had was a lot of people, at least in their current projects, have been trying to not really remix the corrupt or incompetent cop, but lean into it more, especially because of what's going on in the world and the conversations that's going on, at least in the United States where I'm located, where people are really seeing how the the criminal justice system, is very corrupt and incompetent, and how it's interesting how writers are really infusing that into their works, maybe decentering police stories, or moving away from that, or at least depicting it in not the traditional way of like, oh, you know, these rugged cops who are like smart, or vigilantes, or always out for justice. I think that was an interesting thing that I've seen happen. I try to do that in my own works, because like I said, I really like critiquing institutions in the stuff that I do. Um, Another trend that I think I see a lot of, at least with mystery specifically, is the locked room mystery. I think in the recent past, there's the cartographers, which we talked about earlier, starts off with a locked room mystery. There is a dead body in a room of the New York Public Library that our protagonist is emotionally and personally invested in, and our protagonist has to solve. And the question is like, well, how did this murder happen? There are security cameras. The killer couldn't have gone in and out. Another recent one is Far From the Light of Heaven by Tade Thompson, which is a locker room mystery set in a spaceship where a pile of dead bodies has been found, and nobody knows how it happened, and nobody knows where the killer is, and the spaceship is completely empty. So like, how did this happen? Um, and another recent one, which I didn't read, but from everybody because it's such a popular book, I hear Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir is a locker room mystery. I do want to dig into it, but the the volume of the work is very intimidating to me. But just knowing, seeing all of these works of being really celebrated and lauded, and like, oh, people are really into locked room mysteries. There's something about the puzzle element to it that's really captivating to the imagination. So yeah, those are a couple of trends.
Yeah. So I've also noticed as well this trend of like straying away from stories with detectives, or also kind of like characters embedded into the institution as central main characters, because I feel like, especially in recent years, as you pointed out, in New York, and also especially like here in like East and Southeast Asia, and especially in Hong Kong, there's this growing awareness of corrupt the how corrupt the institution is as a whole, and not just individual cops or like law enforcement. And so there's been a growing amount of stories that directly critique that as well, and are very anti-institutional in a way that kind of um remove the central characters from the center of kind of like institutional scaffoldings, and kind of critique it as at a remove. And I'm trying to think of some right now, and a well, it's not exactly like really new, but for I guess answer justice can answer justice, and also its sequels as well, center the main characters as a rebel, and kind of I'm trying to find the right words for it right now, but kind of like how do I say this? Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's like there's a trend I'm seeing that removes the main characters from like central institutions. I'm rambling right now, so
No, I think I know where you're going though. We're looking, perhaps you're talking about amateur sleuths, maybe,
Yeah.
and then people who become are they're thrust into the role of detective, not necessarily because they're a cop or because they are definitely a private detective, but because a situation has occurred in which they find themselves kind of drawn into the mystery or solving whatever the mystery or the crime is.
yeah. And also there are so many different kinds of mysteries as well that don't necessarily have to use the cop or the detective or the private eye as main characters. For example, like journalists, investigative journalists,
Yeah.
reporters as well, and also perhaps yeah, there's this one book I've read recently, No Spoon Burning Age.
Mm,
It's kind of a mystery, not exactly a mystery, but more of a um thriller that doesn't have a main character that who is a, like a regular cop or
Right.
like yeah, a detective, but it's
right.
more like a spy being forced into a difficult situation. And when you if you're talking about things that aren't exactly sci-fi, there's this film I watched recently called Hand Rolled Cigarette. It's a Hong Kong neo noir film that is about a ex-cop and um a drug smuggler, and the ex-cop is also a gangster, and the way they make that work in critiquing kind of like the institution as a whole, as opposed to older like noir films or neo noir films that are about like cops spying on gangsters and stuff like that,
Mhm.
is really, I don't know, it's really effective and something that I'm really really into as well. So yeah.
Yeah.
Evan, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Evan, what was the name of that last movie that you were saying? Hand Wrought Cigarette? What was it?
Hand rolled
Hand rolled
cigarette.
cigarette.
Hand Rolled Cigarette. Okay, cool.
It's on Netflix. Yeah.
Check
Awesome.
that out. Love recommendations. We
Mhm.
have about 3 minutes left, and I want to encourage the audience to go ahead and drop your questions into the chat, and we'll leave the last 10 minutes to dive into some of your questions. But before we get there, one more question for our panelists, and that is just about how you effectively weave mystery into sort of a genre, piece of work versus, something more traditional or more realistic. What are some of the challenges you have or some of the processes I think that you use, perhaps that you use to weave mystery into genre work as opposed to commercial?
I think for me, going back to the initial discussion of how every book, every mystery is a story. So you're kind of juggling two mysteries or maybe three mysteries when you're doing spec fic mystery or spec fic thriller, which is you're unfolding the mystery of the plot, like, who killed who, and you're also unfolding the mystery of this world. You have to establish if it's a fantasy world, you have to establish the rules of this world, what this world looks like, the magic system if you have one. If this is a science fiction work, you have to establish where you are in place and time and what the level of technology is. So you're kind of juggling two mysteries, and one of the main roles or one of the main duties of the writer is judicious reveals of information. When do you reveal and how you reveal it? And so when you have like two tracks of things that you have to reveal, it's kind of a juggling act. I always struggle with, am I doing too much world building exposition, which is a mystery in itself, and am I doing too much of the plot? And ideally you would a writer would be able to weave them together seamlessly, but that is always difficult. So I think, at least for me, that's one of the challenges. How you unfold the mystery of your speculative world. I don't think that's a difficulty that realistic fiction has to grapple with. Everything is kind of a given. Um, and on that note, that also kind of ties into the advantages, I think, of the speculative fiction world is that Mm, when you're when you're approaching a science fiction story or a fantasy story, you can't take anything as a given because it's going to be a new world. And when you can't take anything as a given, that is like, that is the most interesting thing. That's a driving force for a mystery. Like there are questions here, and you can exploit that because you know it's a fantasy world, so you know that there's going to be, let's say, a pantheon of gods, right? So the reader hopefully is interested. Oh, they mentioned this god here. I wonder what the other gods are like. And you draw out those questions and answer them or reveal them in the right places, and that draws a reader to keep reading, even though you might not be revealing much of the whodunit plot. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like one of the advantages of speculative fiction is that um, there's always the sense of like you can't take anything at face value. Nothing is as it seems, and that's what mysteries are. Like you you can't take anything at face value. You know there's something deeper, and so if a writer is doing it right, the sense of like discovering what that deeper thing is revealed both in the world building and in the plot itself, and the character, obviously, of course, but mostly those two main engines.
Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So I definitely agree with you there in that a mystery, especially when you embed it into a secondary world, you have to juggle both, like multiple mysteries at once. The mystery of how this world works, and also the mystery of perhaps who killed this person and what happened to that thing. But then I also think that kind of like mysteries are themselves embedded into their settings. You can't have a mystery without thinking about like what happened and why it happened. And the question of why it happened is also a question of the setting, I guess. And so you get stuff like uh, the book I mentioned earlier, Anne Marie, called Empire, where the main character has to figure out what happened to her predecessor. And that ties into the politics of the world itself, and also the wider politics of the world beyond that specific setting, and also its history as well. And so by solving that mystery, the central character is also solving the question of how the politics of this world works, and trying to balance her kind of like her job as part of that world with the pressing need to solve that mystery because it's a danger to her. And so we get those layers as well. And I guess another interesting thing I thought of like is science fiction and fantasy in video games, because like if we're talking about the mystery in a science fiction game, for example, I've recently been playing Disco Elysium. It's such a good one, and the central mystery as well is so much about setting and also the exploration of the setting that helps with solving the mystery as well. And with video games, you also have the sense of having to like engage with the world and also be very tactile with the world and find clues that lead you to other clues, and in that process learn more about that world itself. And so I kind of also think that if you're talking about like fiction and writing itself, you can also like do that in having the main characters explore the world, be more tactile with the world, and like read I don't know, read the letter, or I don't know, engage with like the stuff around them in order to solve the mystery they're solving, which can kind of really, really bring that to life as well. So yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, let's dive into a few audience questions. First one, at what stage of writing, this is from Allison, thank you, Allison. At what stage of writing do you typically know the end answer? Do you plan it at the beginning or find it along the way?
Uh, for me, I already know it from the beginning. I think um, I've I've learned through the hard way that with a mystery, everything has to like come together almost seamlessly. That um, me finding my way through a question or an answer is a very inefficient way of writing. But that is me. I have heard that, Agatha Christie, when she wrote her novels, sometimes she didn't know what the answer was, and then she worked through it, and that's why you have like 10 suspects and 20 clues because she wants to have the option by the closer to the end of the writing to just say, okay, I think I want this person to do it, and this is how. I think it differs, at least for me, because I find it inefficient to draft and redraft and like have the passive cards fall apart when I forget something. I start out with the question and the answer already set from the very beginning.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of the opposite in that I'm a really exploratory writer. I really love that sense of like figuring out what is happening in the first draft. But I know that if I'm writing a mystery or a noir, like I'm doing right now, it's going to be a world of trouble when it comes to revisions because you have to figure out so many different plot holes that you never realize when you're like doing like when you're planting and realize that, oh, this character isn't the killer after all, and or like you figure out something that you have to layer in to earlier parts to foreshadow another character who is a suspect or even the perpetrator of, like, I guess, the main mystery itself. So what I usually do is do a really, really bare bones first draft. That's almost a outline of the draft. And so that can allow me room to kind of like explore and know what I want, how I want it to end. And I do that with as minimal effort as I can. And then in revisions, I get to the meaty part of it and do this whole outlining and re-outlining my first draft and layering things within it to tighten up the plot and make sure that all the jigsaw puzzles are falling into place. So that's how I do it.
Excellent. Kind of very similar process for me as well. I do have to know, I used to enjoy being an exploratory writer until you get on deadline, then that kind of goes out the window. So now I plot, especially when you're talking mystery, it's outline, outline, outline. I have to know what's going to happen at the end. I have to know who's done it. I have to know who the culprit is. That's the only way to get to the end quickly and make the editing process as painless as possible. But that's my process. I'm going to move on because we only have a couple minutes. I'm going to hop over to this question. What is the biggest mistake you see writers making when it comes to creating and fostering mystery? And that's from Mikkel Whistler. The biggest mistake you see writers making when it comes to creating and fostering a mystery.
Um, Okay, well, I don't want to slag other writers, but I think I'm just gonna speak for myself, because I'm still fairly new as a writer, and one of the common mistakes that I do, and I think a lot of my friends who are in the same stage of career as me also do, is answer it right away and do it in such a way where it's uh, not tightly woven into the character. Like when you have a mystery, you have a question that needs to be answered, but you have a questioner. You have a character who is asking that question, and you have to uh, kind of establish early on why is this character so doggedly trying to answer this question? What is propelling this character? And this character is the one that the reader is following. So if this character doesn't seem to have a strong motivation to answer that ultimate question, the reader won't have a strong motivation to keep following this character, even if the question is very compelling. I think if the character doesn't seem like why does he want to solve this murder? Is it just out of curiosity? Is it because of a personal investment? Is it because the main character is in peril? That's why he needs to answer this. I think if you have a strong character motivation for your main character to answer this question and establish it early on, and obviously build on that motivation as the story progresses. I think that's going to propel the reader to keep going because you're not just pulling the reader with the question, you're pulling the reader because of the emotional investment into this character. And like, I get this character's reason. I had the same reason to answer this question, so I'm going to keep reading.
Yeah, and I'm also going to hop on to what Victor said in that I think you have to remember like the stakes has to be tightly woven into the characteristics as well. Like the stakes of the mystery and also the stakes of the world kind of I don't want to say means nothing if it doesn't connect to the character, but a huge part of why readers are engaged with certain mysteries they or why they want to know the answer is because of a personal investment or a sense of relatability to the entire situation, whether it's from the victim's point of view or from the protagonist's point of view. So if the if what is happening and what kind of mystery the protagonist is trying to solve isn't married to the stakes, the personal stakes um of the main character as well, I feel like it kind of dampens the mystery and the suspense a bit. And so it's why I struggle a lot with trying to build a mystery that can, yeah, that can engage readers, like when I was just starting as well. So, yeah.
Thank you both. I believe we are at the end of our time. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. Thank you, Victor and Ewan. It was just an awesome conversation. So I think we will probably have to end here. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.